He thought it was just a stray dog at first, but the dog already knew who he was. The night air in Cedar Ridge carried that dry, metallic chill that clung to your lungs like something unfinished, the kind of cold that made streetlights hum a little louder and shadows stretched just a second too long. And Officer Daniel Hayes sat in his patrol car with the engine idling low, watching the empty intersection flicker between red and green with no one left to obey it. His shift nearly over, 12 hours behind him, boots heavy, eyes tired in that quiet way that doesn't come from sleep but from memory. And that's when he saw it again. The same small shape at the edge of the sidewalk, barely more than a shadow at first, unmoving, patient, like it had nowhere else to be. A German Shepherd puppy, no more than a few months old, its coat dusty and uneven, one ear not quite standing yet, eyes fixed on him in a way that felt intentional. And Daniel frowned, because this wasn't the first time, not tonight, not even this week. He had noticed it earlier near the gas station on Maple, then again by the old hardware store 2 blocks down. Always at a distance, always watching, never begging, never barking, just there, as if waiting for something he hadn't yet done. And when Daniel stepped out of the cruiser, the cold hit him sharper, wrapping around his uniform as gravel crunched under his boots. The puppy didn't run, didn't flinch, it just tilted its head slightly. That soft, searching motion animals make when they're trying to understand something beyond words. And, for a second, something in Daniel's chest tightened in a way he couldn't explain. "Hey," he muttered, voice low, cautious, like approaching a witness instead of a stray. But the dog didn't move toward him, didn't wag its tail, didn't act like a dog that wanted food or comfort. Instead it turned, slow and deliberate, took a few steps down the dim side street, then stopped, looking back over its shoulder. And there was something in that look. Not fear, not hunger, something closer to expectation, like it already knew he would follow. And Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand across the back of his neck, trying to shake off the feeling. "Not tonight," he said under his breath, more to himself than the dog, because this wasn't part of the job. Not anymore. Not after everything that had taught him where following instincts could lead. But when he turned back toward the cruiser, the silence behind him pressed in heavier than before, and he glanced back, just once, and the puppy was still there, still watching, unmoving, as if time had stalled around it. And that's when the unease settled deeper, not loud, not urgent, just a quiet weight, the kind that lingers in the corners of your thoughts long after you try to ignore it. Daniel opened the car door, paused, then closed it again with a soft click, the decision not fully conscious, more like something old and buried nudging its way back to the surface. And when he looked up again, the puppy had taken a few more steps down the street, stopping beneath a flickering street lamp that cast its small frame in uneven light. And for a moment, the world felt narrowed. To that single point, officer and dog, distance and silence, something unfinished hanging between them like a question neither one could say out loud. And Daniel felt it then, not as fear, but as recognition, faint, distant, like a memory trying to return, and he didn't know why, not yet. But he knew one thing with a certainty that settled into his bones before his mind could argue with it. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. And whatever that dog wanted, it had chosen him for a reason. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the faint scent of damp concrete, and something older, something that did not belong to this hour. And Daniel stood there longer than he should have, his breath visible in the cold as he watched the puppy take another careful step forward, then pause again as if measuring the distance between them, not in feet but in trust. And there was something deliberate in the rhythm of it. Step, stop, look back, like a quiet signal repeated until understood. And Daniel felt the weight of that pattern settle into him, because it was not unfamiliar, not entirely. It echoed something from years ago, from training grounds and long nights when silence meant more than words ever could. And he exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried decision with it. And without fully realizing it, he began to walk, boots steady against the cracked pavement, keeping just enough distance not to startle the animal, but close enough not to lose it. And the puppy responded instantly, continuing forward down the narrow side street that most people avoided after dark, where the streetlights grew sparse and the buildings leaned inward like they had stories they were not ready to tell. And Daniel's radio crackled softly at his shoulder, a distant voice checking in, routine, ordinary, but it felt far away now, like something from a different world, and he did not answer right away. His focus locked ahead on the small moving shape that never once broke its pace or turned in uncertainty, as if it knew exactly where it was going. And that certainty unsettled him more than anything else, because animals wandered. They hesitated, they followed instinct, but this felt like intention, like memory guiding motion. And as they moved deeper into the street, the temperature seemed to drop a few degrees, the kind of chill that slipped through fabric and settled along the spine. And Daniel pulled his jacket tighter without thinking, his eyes scanning the surroundings, the boarded windows, the rusted chain-link fences, the quiet hum of a distant transformer, all of it forming a backdrop that pressed in on the moment. And still the puppy did not look back this time, as if it trusted he was there, as if the choice had already been made. And that was when Daniel noticed the faint detail he had missed before, something small against the dog's neck, a thin strip of worn material, barely visible beneath the uneven fur, and his pace slowed just enough to focus, narrowing his eyes, trying to catch the angle of it under the dim light. A collar, or what was left of one, frayed at the edges, aged, not something new, not something temporary, and something about that detail struck him harder than it should have, because stray dogs did not always carry remnants like that, not ones that moved with this kind of purpose. And a thought surfaced, quiet at first, then sharper, pulling at the edges of his memory, and he shook his head slightly, dismissing it before it could fully form, because some thoughts were easier left alone. Some questions did not need answers at the end of a long shift, and yet his feet kept moving, matching the steady pace ahead of him, and the street narrowed further before opening into a small lot behind an abandoned building, the kind of place that collected forgotten things, broken crates, discarded metal, silence layered over silence. And the puppy slowed there, its steps softer now, more careful, until it finally stopped near the edge of the lot, just within the reach of a flickering overhead light that buzzed faintly in protest of the cold. And Daniel felt his pulse shift, not faster, not slower, just different, like something inside him was bracing without knowing why. And when the puppy finally turned back to face him fully, its eyes catching the uneven light, there was no fear in them, no urgency, just a quiet insistence, as if this was the place, as if whatever reason had drawn them together had led here, to this exact spot. And Daniel took one more step forward, then another, the gravel shifting beneath his boots as the silence deepened around them. And in that stillness, he realized something that settled into him with quiet certainty. This was no longer about a stray dog, and whatever waited here had been waiting longer than just tonight. Daniel did not speak at first, because something in the air felt too fragile for words, like even a breath too loud might break whatever truth had been waiting here. And the puppy stood still a few feet ahead of him, its small chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm, eyes never leaving his, as if confirming that he had finally arrived where he was meant to be. And for a moment nothing moved except the faint flicker of the overhead light, casting uneven shadows across the cracked pavement, stretching and pulling the shapes of things into something unfamiliar. And Daniel took another step forward, slower this time, more careful, his gaze lowering slightly as he began to notice details that had been hidden in the dark before. The outline of an old crate pushed against the wall, weathered wood splintered at the edges, a thin layer of dust and debris gathered around it as though it had been untouched for a long time. And the puppy shifted its weight, stepping closer to the crate before stopping again, glancing back at him with that same quiet insistence. And something in Daniel's chest tightened again, sharper now, like a thread being pulled loose from somewhere deep, and he moved closer, boots crunching softly as he approached, the scent of damp wood and cold metal growing stronger with each step. And when he finally reached the crate, he crouched slowly, one knee pressing against the ground as he leaned forward, his hand hovering for just a second before resting against the edge of the wood, feeling its rough surface beneath his fingers, grounding him in the moment. And that was when he saw it, not all at once, but in pieces, like a memory coming back in fragments. A worn fabric tucked near the corner, partially hidden beneath the shadows. And he reached for it carefully, pulling it free just enough for the light to catch it, revealing a faded strap, old, frayed, the color dulled by time, and attached to it, barely visible but unmistakable, A small metal tag, scratched, worn down, but still holding onto the shape of something once clear, and Daniel's breath caught. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet pause that lingered longer than it should have. And he turned the tag slightly, angling it toward the light, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make out the lettering, and for a second, the world around him seemed to fall away. The hum of the streetlights, the distant noise of the city, all of it fading into a kind of silence that pressed inward, because he knew that shape, he knew that kind of tag, and even before the letters fully came into focus, something inside him had already recognized it, and he shook his head slightly, as if denying it before it could settle, but his fingers tightened around the edge of the strap, and he leaned closer, forcing himself to see it clearly. And when the name finally caught the light, faint but still there, it did not come as a surprise. It came as something worse, something heavier, something that had been waiting beneath the surface for longer than he had allowed himself to remember, and his shoulders tensed, a slow exhale leaving him as his gaze dropped from the tag to the ground beside the crate, where the shadows shifted just enough to reveal another shape, still, quiet, resting in a way that spoke not of movement, but of time having passed. And Daniel did not reach out this time. He did not move forward right away, because he understood now. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. Enough to feel the weight of it settle into his chest like something unfinished finally demanding to be seen. And behind him, the puppy took a small step closer, not urgent, not afraid, just present, as if it had carried this moment for as long as it could, and was now placing it gently into his hands. And Daniel swallowed slowly, his voice barely more than a breath as it finally came, low and unsteady. I know this. Not a question, not really, more like an admission, and the silence that followed did not answer him. But it did not need to, because in that quiet space, with the cold pressing in and the faint light flickering above, Daniel realized something that made his chest ache in a way he could not push away. This had never been about finding something new. It had been about coming back to something he had left behind. The name on the tag did not need to be fully clear for Daniel to feel it, because memory does not wait for confirmation. It arrives all at once, heavy and undeniable, and his grip on the worn strap tightened slightly as the past began to surface in quiet fragments, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to press against his chest and remind him of something he had tried to file away as finished, as handled, as done. But it was never really done, not the way he had told himself, and he lowered his head for a moment, eyes fixed on the tag as if staring long enough might change what it meant, but it did not. It stayed the same, steady, patient, like the dog standing behind him, and he exhaled slowly, the breath uneven, before finally shifting his gaze toward the shape resting near the crate, not moving, not reacting, simply there. And there was no fear in it, no shock, just a quiet stillness that spoke of time having passed without anyone noticing. And Daniel felt something inside him give slightly, not breaking, not yet, but loosening in a way that made it harder to stand upright. And he leaned back just enough to sit on his heel, his hand still holding the strap, as if letting go would mean losing the moment entirely. And behind him, the soft sound of small paws against gravel drew closer, the puppy stepping into the faint circle of light beside him, not rushing, not hesitant, simply joining him. And for the first time since this had begun, Daniel reached out, his free hand moving slowly, carefully, until his fingers brushed against the puppy's fur, rougher than it should have been for something so young, but warm, alive, present. And the puppy did not pull away, did not flinch. It leaned into the touch slightly, a small, quiet acceptance that carried more weight than any sound could have. And Daniel swallowed, his voice low, almost lost in the stillness. You stayed. And the words were not really meant for the puppy, not entirely. They were meant for everything that had led to this moment, for the time that had passed unnoticed, for the space between what had happened and what had been remembered. And he shook his head slightly, as if trying to piece together something that refused to form clearly, because the memory was there, but incomplete, like a scene missing its beginning. And that was when another detail surfaced, small, almost insignificant, but enough to pull at the edges of recognition. The call, the address, the report that had come through on a night not unlike this one. Late, quiet, easy to overlook in the middle of a long shift. And Daniel's eyes closed for just a second, Not long. Just enough for the weight of that recollection to settle. And when he opened them again, the lot looked different. Not physically, but in the way meaning changes a place, in the way silence becomes something more than absence. And he looked down at the puppy again, studying its face, the steady gaze, the calm presence. And something in that look made the truth harder to avoid, because this was not random. This was not coincidence. This was connection, carried across time in a way he did not fully understand but could no longer deny. And his hand moved slightly, resting more firmly against the puppy's neck, fingers brushing against the worn piece of collar that still clung there. And he felt the rough edge of it beneath his touch, a remnant of something that had once belonged, something that had once been known. And his chest tightened again, sharper now, the kind of feeling that comes when realization begins to take shape whether you are ready for it or not. And he let out a slow breath, his voice barely above a whisper as the words finally formed with more certainty. You were not just following me. And the puppy held his gaze, unmoving, as if the answer had always been there, waiting for him to say it out loud. And Daniel nodded faintly to himself, the truth settling into place piece by piece. Not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, undeniable, and far too heavy to ignore any longer. Daniel stayed there longer than he realized, the cold no longer something he noticed, but something that had become part of the moment itself, like the silence, like the faint hum of the light above, like the steady presence of the small dog pressed gently against his side, and his fingers remained curled around the worn strap, the edges of it rough against his skin, grounding him in something that felt both distant and immediate at the same time. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the rest of the memory began to return, not in a rush, but in fragments that stitched themselves together with quiet precision. The radio call that night, low priority, no reported threat, just a disturbance, an abandoned property, possible stray animals, something easy to push aside when other calls felt more urgent. And he remembered the way he had glanced at the screen, the address briefly lighting up before fading into the background of a shift that had already stretched too long. And he had told himself someone else would take it, that it could wait, that it was not critical. And now standing here, in this exact place, he understood the weight of that decision in a way he had not allowed himself to before, and his jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in something quieter, something closer to regret that had been waiting beneath the surface for a long time. And he shook his head faintly, as if trying to undo something that had already been done. But the moment did not change. The crate remained, the tag remained, the stillness remained, and beside him, the puppy shifted slightly, pressing closer for just a second before settling again, its presence steady, patient, like it had never expected anything more than this. And that realization struck him harder than anything else, because the dog had not followed him out of fear. It had not chased him out of hunger. It had waited, and waiting required something deeper, something that carried time with it. And Daniel lowered his gaze to the small animal, studying it more closely now, the lines of its face, the shape of its eyes, the faint pattern in its coat that mirrored something he could not ignore anymore. And his breath caught slightly as recognition deepened, not as a sudden shock, but as a quiet confirmation of what had already been forming inside him. And he leaned forward just enough to bring his forehead closer, not touching, just near, his voice low, almost lost in the space between them. You knew. And the words carried no accusation, only understanding, because this had never been about finding him randomly. This had been about remembering him. And Daniel felt something shift inside his chest. Something heavier than guilt, but softer than despair. Something that did not demand punishment, but did not allow escape either. And he closed his eyes briefly, the image of that ignored call replaying with more clarity now, the address, the time, the decision to move on. And when he opened them again, he looked around the lot with new awareness, seeing not just what was there, but what had been missed, what had been left. And his hand moved instinctively, resting more firmly against the puppy's side, fingers threading lightly through its fur as if anchoring both of them to the present. And the puppy responded with a small shift, leaning into him again, quiet, trusting, as if nothing needed to be proven anymore. And Daniel let out a slow breath, the kind that carries acceptance rather than resistance. And he nodded once, barely noticeable, but enough to mark the moment. because he understood now that this was not about going back. It was about what came next, and he carefully set the worn strap down for a moment, his movements deliberate, respectful, before reaching both hands toward the puppy, lifting it gently, supporting its small body against his chest, and the dog did not resist, did not hesitate. It settled into him with a quiet ease that spoke of something deeper than familiarity, and Daniel held it there for a second longer than necessary, his grip steady, his breathing slow, as if adjusting to the weight of something he had not expected to carry. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was softer, steadier, carrying a quiet promise that did not need to be loud to be real. "You are not staying here anymore." And the words lingered in the cold air, not dramatic, not forced, just true. And for the first time since this began, the silence around them felt different, not empty, not heavy, but shifting, as if something that had been waiting had finally been answered. Daniel did not rush as he stood, the puppy held securely against his chest, its small body warm through the fabric of his uniform. And for a moment he simply remained there, letting the stillness settle into something new, something quieter, something that no longer pressed in from all sides but instead seemed to open just slightly, like the night itself was making room for what came next. And he glanced once more at the crate, at the worn strap resting where he had placed it, and the faint outline beside it that marked what had been left behind. And he did not look away quickly this time. He let himself see it fully, not as something to avoid but as something to acknowledge, because some things did not need fixing, they needed remembering. And he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, before turning away, boots shifting against the gravel as he began to walk back the way he had come, each step steady, measured, the puppy quiet in his arms as if it understood that the direction had changed, that the waiting was over, and the cold air moved around them again, brushing past in soft currents that carried the faint hum of the city beyond the narrow street. And as Daniel stepped back under the first flickering light, the world seemed to widen again, the tightness of the lot giving way to the open stretch of pavement, and he adjusted his hold slightly, one hand supporting the puppy more securely as it shifted just enough to settle its head against his shoulder, and the contact was small, almost nothing, but it carried a weight that surprised him, not heavy, not burdensome, just real, and he let out a slow breath, feeling the rhythm of it steady in a way it had not been earlier. And as he reached the mouth of the side street, he paused, not because he needed to, but because something inside him asked for it, a quiet instinct that had not been there before, and he turned his head slightly, looking back down the narrow stretch they had come from, the dim lights, the shadows, the place that now held more meaning than it ever had. And for a second, the memory of the ignored call flickered again, not sharp this time, not accusing, just present, like a marker of where things had changed, and he exhaled slowly, his voice barely more than a breath. "I should have come." And the words did not echo, did not demand response. They simply settled into the night, carried away by the cold air as easily as they had formed. And then he turned forward again, stepping out onto the main street where the distant glow of traffic lights and storefront signs softened the darkness. And the shift from silence to sound was subtle but noticeable. The faint rumble of a passing car, the low buzz of electricity in overhead lines, the distant murmur of a late-night city continuing without pause. And Daniel walked toward his cruiser, the familiar shape of it waiting under a street lamp that cast a steady, unbroken light. And as he approached, he opened the rear door carefully, lowering the puppy onto the seat with a gentleness that felt instinctive, not practiced, his hand lingering for a second longer than necessary against its back, as if confirming it was real, that this moment was not something that would fade when he looked away. And the puppy remained still, watching him with those same steady eyes, calm, unafraid, as if this place, this new space, was already understood. And Daniel closed the door softly, moving around to the driver's side, the familiar motion of his routine returning but altered now, quieter, more deliberate. And when he sat down behind the wheel, he did not start the engine right away. He rested his hands lightly on the steering wheel, staring ahead through the windshield at the empty street, the traffic light changing from red to green again, without anyone there to notice. And for a moment, everything felt suspended between what had been and what would come next, and he let that moment exist without rushing it, because for the first time in a long while, he understood that not everything needed to be solved immediately. Some things needed to be carried, slowly, carefully, until they found where they belonged, and he glanced once in the rearview mirror, catching the reflection of the puppy sitting quietly behind him, and something in that image settled into place, not as an answer, but as a beginning, and Daniel nodded faintly to himself, his hand finally moving to the ignition as the engine came to life with a low, steady hum, and the cruiser pulled away from the curb, leaving the quiet street behind, carrying with it something that had not been there before, something small, something alive, something that had chosen not to let the past remain unfinished. The cruiser moved through the quiet streets with a steady hum, tires rolling over asphalt that still held the warmth of the day beneath the surface, and Daniel kept his hands firm on the wheel, eyes forward. But his awareness had shifted, no longer scanning for routine, no longer anticipating the next call. Instead, it circled back again and again to the presence behind him, small, silent, steady. And every few seconds his gaze flickered upward to the rearview mirror, catching the reflection of the puppy sitting where he had left it, not pacing, not whining, just watching. And there was something about that stillness that unsettled him more than noise ever could, because it carried understanding, the kind that did not need explanation. And Daniel let out a slow breath, adjusting his grip slightly as the road curved toward the station, the familiar brick building coming into view beneath the glow of overhead lights. And for a moment he hesitated, not in his driving, but in his thoughts, because bringing something like this into that space felt different, like crossing a line he had not planned to cross tonight. But then again, nothing about this night had followed a plan, and he pulled into the lot, the tires crunching softly over gravel before coming to a stop near the side entrance, and the engine idled for a second longer than necessary before he turned it off, the sudden quiet settling around him again, thicker now, more defined, and he sat there for a brief moment, hands resting on the wheel, eyes unfocused, as if allowing the transition from movement to stillness to catch up with him. And then he reached for the door, stepping out into the cool air that felt sharper here under the open sky, and he walked around to the back, opening the door carefully, his movements slower than usual, deliberate in a way that suggested he was aware of every action. And the puppy looked up at him as the door opened, those same steady eyes meeting his without hesitation, and Daniel leaned in slightly, his hand reaching out to support it as he lifted it again, the small body settling naturally into his arms like it had done this before, like it had always known this was where it would end up. And Daniel glanced toward the station entrance, the fluorescent lights inside casting a pale glow through the glass, silhouettes moving occasionally behind the doors, the normal rhythm of a place that did not yet know what had just changed. And he hesitated for just a second, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that stepping inside meant something more than just walking through a door. It meant bringing the past into the present in a way that could not be ignored. And he adjusted his hold slightly, the puppy's head resting lightly against his arm, and he exhaled slowly before moving forward, pushing the door open with his shoulder, the sound of it clicking echoing softly in the hallway as he stepped inside, and the warmth of the building wrapped around them immediately, replacing the cold in a way that felt almost abrupt. And Daniel walked down the corridor, boots steady against the tile floor, the familiar sounds of distant voices and radio chatter filtering through the space, and a few heads turned as he passed, brief glances, curious but not yet questioning, because at first glance it was just a man carrying a dog, something unusual but not unheard of. And Daniel kept moving, not stopping, not explaining, not yet, until he reached the small office near the back, the one he used at the end of his shifts, and he stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click that shut out most of the noise, leaving only a faint hum from the overhead light and the quiet sound of his own breathing. And he moved toward the desk, clearing a small space with one hand before setting the puppy down gently. And it remained there, steady, calm, looking around the room with quiet curiosity, but without fear. And Daniel leaned back slightly against the edge of the desk, his arms crossing loosely as he studied the small animal in front of him, really seeing it now in the clearer light, the details more visible, the faint patterns in its coat, the worn piece of collar still clinging to its neck. And his gaze lingered there for a moment longer, the memory of the tag, the crate, the lot pressing in again. And he reached forward slowly, his fingers brushing against the collar, turning it just enough to catch the light, and his breath caught slightly as the faint lettering became clearer than before, not fully restored, but enough to confirm what he had already begun to understand. And he shook his head once, not in denial this time, but in quiet acceptance, and his voice, when it came, was low, steady, carrying a weight that no one else in the room could hear. "You came back for me." And the puppy held his gaze, unmoving, as if the answer had never been in question, and Daniel nodded faintly, the realization settling deeper, not as something overwhelming, but as something certain, something that had already changed him before he had even stepped through that door. And he lowered his hand gently to rest against the dog's back, fingers still, grounding himself in the present, because whatever came next, he knew one thing with absolute clarity now. This was not something he was going to walk away from again. Daniel did not move for a while, his hand resting lightly on the puppy's back as if the simple contact could hold everything in place, the past, the present, the quiet understanding that had settled between them without needing explanation. And the office around him remained still, the faint hum of the overhead light blending with the distant murmur of voices beyond the closed door, a reminder that the world outside continued as it always had, unaware of the shift that had just taken place. Inside this small room, and Daniel's gaze remained fixed on the worn collar, the faint letters that had confirmed what he already knew but had never expected to face again. And slowly, he exhaled, the breath leaving him with a weight that felt both heavy and relieving at the same time, like something long held finally finding its way out. And he reached for the drawer at the side of his desk, pulling it open with a soft scrape, his movements deliberate, almost careful, as if each action carried meaning now. And from inside he took out a small cloth, something he used to clean equipment, nothing special, but tonight it felt different, and he brought it back to the desk, his fingers brushing gently against the collar again before carefully wiping away the dust that had settled into its worn edges, not trying to restore it, not trying to make it new, just revealing what had always been there. And as he worked, the puppy remained still, watching him with quiet patience, its small body, relaxed but attentive, as if it understood that this moment mattered. And Daniel's jaw tightened slightly as more of the lettering became visible, faint, uneven, but enough to bring clarity where there had been doubt. And he paused for a second, his hand still, the cloth resting lightly against the collar as he took in the name again, not just seeing it, but accepting it. And his voice came low, steady, carrying something deeper than before. "I remember now." And the words were not spoken loudly, not meant for anyone else. They were a quiet acknowledgement, a line drawn between what had been forgotten and what could no longer be ignored. And he set the cloth aside, his hand remaining near the puppy's neck, fingers resting gently against the worn strap as if it were something fragile, something that deserved care even in its age. And the puppy shifted slightly under his touch, leaning just enough to meet his hand. And that small movement carried more weight than anything else in the room, because it was not asking for anything. It was simply there, present, steady, and Daniel felt something in his chest ease, not completely, not all at once, but enough to change the way he stood, the way he breathed, the way he looked at what was in front of him. And he straightened slightly, his shoulders settling into a posture that felt different from before, less guarded, less distant. And he looked around the office, the familiar objects taking on a new context, the desk, the chair, the small stack of reports waiting to be finished, all of it still there, unchanged, but no longer carrying the same weight. And he reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen for a second before unlocking it, scrolling briefly, not searching for anything specific at first, just moving through the motions until he found the report he had not opened that night, the one that had come through quietly and been set aside. And he stared at it for a moment, the address matching the place he had just left, the timestamp marking the moment he had chosen to move on. And he did not look away this time. He did not dismiss it. Instead, he let it sit there, clear, undeniable, and he nodded once, a small, firm motion that carried more resolve than hesitation, and he locked the phone again, setting it down beside the desk with a quiet finality. And when he looked back at the puppy, his expression had changed, not dramatically, not outwardly, but in a way that showed something had shifted inside him, something that would not be undone. and he reached forward again, his hand resting more firmly against the dog's back. A steady, grounding touch, and his voice, when it came, was calm, certain, no longer searching. "You are not here by accident." And the puppy met his gaze without blinking, without hesitation, as if the truth had always been there, waiting for him to see it. And Daniel nodded faintly, the understanding settling into place, not as something overwhelming, but as something that would stay, something that would guide what came next. And in that quiet office, with the door closed and the night pressing softly against the windows, he realized that this was not the end of something left behind. It was the beginning of something that had finally been found. Morning came slowly, not with brightness, but with a soft gray light that slipped through the blinds of the office window, stretching across the desk and settling gently over the small figure curled near the edge. And Daniel had not realized how long he had stayed there until the first sounds of the station shifting into a new day began to rise beyond the walls. Footsteps, quiet voices, the distant ring of a phone, all of it blending into a rhythm that felt both familiar and distant. And he stood near the window now, arms loosely crossed, watching as the puppy stirred slightly, lifting its head with a slow, unhurried motion, blinking against the light, as if adjusting not just to the morning, but to something deeper, something that had changed overnight. And Daniel exhaled softly, the breath steady, grounded, as he stepped back toward the desk, his movements no longer uncertain, no longer weighed down by hesitation, but guided by something quieter, something resolved. And he reached down, his hand brushing gently along the puppy's back, feeling the warmth, the life, the presence that had carried him through a night he would not forget. And the dog responded with a small shift, leaning into the touch with the same quiet trust it had shown from the beginning. And Daniel allowed himself a faint nod, not as a gesture for anyone else, but as something internal, a marker of where he stood now. And he moved to the side of the desk, opening a small cabinet where spare supplies were kept, retrieving a clean piece of fabric and a small metal tag, blank and unused, something meant for inventory, for order. But today it carried a different purpose, and he set them down carefully, his hands steady as he worked, threading the new tag alongside the old worn strap, not replacing it, not removing what had been, but adding to it, acknowledging both the past and what would come next. And his movements were slow, deliberate, each action carrying intention rather than routine. And when he finished, he paused for a moment, looking at the collar now resting lightly against the puppy's neck, the old and the new sitting side by side, not in conflict, but in quiet balance. And he let out a small breath, something close to relief, though he did not name it. And the puppy lifted its head slightly, as if sensing the shift, its eyes meeting his once more, steady, calm, unchanged in the way that mattered most. And Daniel crouched down, bringing himself level with the dog, his hand resting gently along its neck, fingers brushing over both tags. And his voice, when it came, was soft, steady, carrying no weight of regret now. Only something clearer, something forward. "You are not waiting anymore." And the words settled between them without needing anything more. And for a moment, neither of them moved, the quiet stretching just long enough to feel complete. And then Daniel stood, reaching for his jacket, slipping it on with a familiarity that had returned, but with a different kind of awareness beneath it. And he opened the office door, the sounds of the station becoming clearer again as he stepped into the hallway, the world moving forward as it always had. But this time, he moved with it, not behind, not apart. And the puppy followed at his side, not led, not pulled, simply walking beside him with a natural ease that needed no command. And a few heads turned again as they passed, brief glances, curious. But Daniel did not stop, did not explain, because some things did not need to be spoken to be understood. And as he reached the front entrance, the morning light stronger now beyond the glass, he paused for just a second, his hand resting on the door, and he glanced down at the dog beside him, the small figure that had carried something across time just to place it back in his hands. And he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, before pushing the door open and stepping outside, the fresh air meeting him with a different kind of clarity, not sharp, not cold, just clean. And as he walked forward, the dog kept pace beside him, steady, certain, no longer searching. And Daniel did not look back, Not because he had forgotten, but because he finally understood that some things are not meant to be carried behind you. They are meant to walk beside you, quiet, loyal, and real. And in that quiet morning light, with no words left to say and no questions left to answer, the past did not disappear. It simply found its place. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough.